found these pits that you can still identify. Now, these pits are archaic, quotes, in age, judging by the projectile points and smaller implements that you also find in the vicinities. But I've noted the similarity in the general style of tool that's being used.
They were digging pits for stone.
Yes.
Because this is, I think, the crucial thing. Ethnographic data suggests that if you dig, except when you're digging in stone, for stone, you use a wooden tool. And I find it incredible that
Say that again?
That when you're digging, except when you're digging mining stone, when you're mining you need a pick. But otherwise, when you're
Out
digging
of a hard
roots or
material
anything
like
else,
stone, right.
you use something resilient and mildly flexible, i.e. a digging stick.
I.e. bone.
In other
Or
words,
bone.
it gives
But
a lever.
there really isn't any good reason to believe that people in the lower and middle Paleolithic should have been digging out roots and things with stone tools when nobody in their right mind since has ever done this. But it is apparent, for instance, in the Australian data that if you want to chop a great beam out of a tree, then you want something fairly robust and angular.
How do these things compare with the Neolithic and late Paleolithic quarries in Europe?
That's right, Grimes graves and something.
That's all bone.
They're
bone.
quarrying out
There's
of
antler.
salt, which is soft.
They're quarrying
They use
top,
dampler
yeah.
picks.
They use antler.
Yeah.
Also, the
Yeah.
stone is a different sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it cleaves and you spall it off,
Yeah.
right?
We've got quarries that date to terminal Pleistocene times in Angola, where they were quarrying through about 3 to 4 feet of laterite, tericrete, to get at the gravels underneath. There's no evidence of these picks around, and I think it's a question of, Lynn says, ethnographic evidence shows that you dig with a stick. I mean, a lot of hardwoods are sufficiently hard and sufficiently heavy, and the main thing is to get leverage. Unless you're actually working on an outcrop of rock, most of these people were using cobbles, gravels. It's a lever that you need, not something to actually break the rock. So I would suspect.
Why so
the
many
use of
picks then with a real pick with a pointed end in the same going, which certainly don't seem to have been woodworking tools.
You have
in
them
any
as
sense.
these trihedrals in the lower Asherland.
Well, could we
I mean,
qualify
it's
so
like-
many, Glenn, am I right that the frequencies of these things in total Sangoan assemblages that you've handled are fairly low, aren't they?
Of
And
which
even
things?
lower if,
Pointed
say,
picks.
Colombo,
Point-
pointed picks.
Well, let's see, I can't even recall right now the percentage. I would say in the range of 5% possibly.
Yeah. Well, Desmond, there are about 4 or 5 at is it A4 at Colombo?
I can't remember what the Colombo.
Because for
I haven't
Pemong,
done
the
it for a long
so-called
time.
Chiraman,
It's a low percentage by
yes.
comparison with the small
Yeah.
tool element. Yeah.
Cran Cook is trying to isolate the Chiraman as a separate or late or final phase of the Sangoan in Rhodesia from both Kami and Pemongwe, and these things have 2-3% of picks, and well, he pulls in other things which he calls hand axes as well. I've not seen these, but together it's a minute percentage.
Yeah,
of the total
this is
percentage.
true, yes. And what has slanted the issue in the past is the fact that people have been collecting selectively from river gravels, and they've collected all the big stuff, left the little stuff behind, even if it was there. And so you've got an idea of the Sangoan consisting almost entirely of these big heavy elements, which is quite
Well, I
completely wrong.
don't think that's, I think what you say at first is quite true, but I think the corollary doesn't follow, because it doesn't matter what's missing, it's what's present that tells you what it is anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't mean it tells you all it is, it just
No.
tells you that it's very distinctive.
Yes.
You know, you can identify a Bentley only by looking at the radiator, you don't have to see the whole car.
Yeah.
And I think this is the point in this case, that why these very distinctive kinds of things in a place where they have no bloody business being?
Yeah.
That's the question we're really asking.
Yeah.
If there's any selectivity in this collection you viewed yesterday, it would be because the water apparently washed away some of the smaller things. The collections were made of everything that looked like it had been flaked or in
I
any manner.
don't really believe that, because I've collected from some of these gravels so far as Rhodesia, Zambia is concerned, and there is not the quantity of small elements present that there are in other seal sites, cave sites, and so on. So I think that this probably represents a special activity. They were making these big things down by these streams for some reason or other. Further than that, one cannot go.
Glenn, go ahead.
Venture a suggestion that if we are going to discuss the later stuff, we probably have to
start right
lead
now.
with Sanguine.
Yeah, yeah. Could I just, by way of summary, presumably Fred would like some sort of group opinion, and could I just throw one out, and everyone else can raise hue and cry and disagree, that most of us have recognized that all the material that we've seen bears a strong resemblance to what we think of as Sangoan, but that we have to admit that we haven't got adequate numerical control over what we call Sangoan, and that we therefore can't come to a final conclusion. We can only tentatively say, yes, the range of types is there, and really more than that we can't say.
Very succinctly put.
Tony, what would you like us to do in terms of things like the Cormousan before we move on?
I'm not sure what you mean in terms of these questions.
Well, I asked some general questions. Those are just devices. You think there was some discussion around the samples of collections that we saw yesterday. I'm sure you have some questions. Who wants to fire away? Let's say the Cormousan.
Tony,
Things like that.
some of us anyway who would be intrigued to find out whether we could persuade you to view the Cormousan as a late phase of the Mousterian, and to refer to it as a Cormousan phase rather than a distinct industry. You've shown us very beautifully, very clearly what specifically the differences are, both in the range of types and the proportion. This is really beautiful work. What's bugging us is having to cope with yet another name and another discrete entity. Could you be persuaded to look on it as part of a gross technological continuum?
Well, while it may be a gross technological continuum, I feel I do not have a large section of what might be that continuum. And I think it would be very dangerous to assume, or at least to say to publication, that it is part of a continuum if I cannot so demonstrate. I don't doubt that the Cormousan does come out of some sort of base that is very similar to the Mousterian. We don't have it in our area, that intermediate development.
Well, the
I
mere
don't
fact.
see that it doesn't develop out.
Yeah, I quite understand that. The mere fact that we are dealing with yet another local set of samples, which is the product essentially of a discoid and a Levallois technique, automatically lumps it in with.
Well, I'm not sure.
Then you would put the Ethereum with as a phase of the Mousterian also?
Many people do. Many people do.
I'm not
Shouldn't-
sure I would
shouldn't we
want to
take this
group
up this
all
afternoon?
the
Yeah, I would think so.
technology.
This is really, we're talking about this afternoon's
Yeah,
topic.
but
Yeah.
let's try to
I'm
be more
curious about one
Later,
thing.
what-
I have
Yeah.
never handled any sites which are considered in that wide range of still bay where Levallois technique is at least apparently described for it.
It's there.
The pictures certainly indicate it's there. In terms of just the Levallois technique itself, how comparable is the Cormousan to the still bay material? The Cormousan seems to be particularly fine in terms of Levallois technique.
Yes.
Is this way outside of the range of what one might expect in still bay?
Sorry, I seem to keep chipping in.
Well, again, we're talking about this
Again, this is
afternoon's topic.
afternoon's topic.
We really
Well,
are.
this-
Well, can we say anything about the Cormousan that isn't going to come up this afternoon?
Yes,
Sure we can. I asked some questions about that.
Yeah.
Right.
We're
Top
talking in
page
terms of the
4.
environment.
Can Can I ask in connection with the ecological conditions dealing with the Mousterian, is there any evidence to show that there were any different conditions at that time than existed during Acheulean times? Because there is such a complete change in the lithic components of the assemblages. Is this a question of tradition, new groups, if we can talk about groups coming in, or are there ecological differences that could have brought this change about?
From Acheulean to Mousterian?
Locally, yeah.
I don't really think we have the evidence. I think Carl suggested that the soils in the old pediments suggest a more humid situation, and perhaps becoming less humid in the Mousterian than it was in the Acheulean. But beyond that, I don't think we have any evidence.
Where does your Cormuzan fit in stratigraphically? Is that in the De Berriger?
It's in the De Berriger.
Well, in terms of
So there's a gap.
the Egyptian evidence, the wadis in the eastern desert were as defunct that time as they've ever been. In other words, I would say that conditions were as dry in the eastern desert during the period of time represented by this particular formation as it's possible to conceive.
Well, in that case, this would mean that there would be a movement of population onto the river, that there would be a low Nile, presumably, and the
High Nile, no problem there, but
High Nile.
but the wadis were doing nothing. As evidence in Kamambo, that we simply don't even have the simplest of intercalations of wadi rubble, except in very minute bands here and there in places where today you have broad wadis, suggesting that conditions in the eastern desert were even drier than now. So it would have been a very much restricted floodplain situation.
Yeah.
Well, this agrees with our indication also that the dunes were moving. This was a period of maximum movement of sand.
Well, this
Also, surely, if you're talking about the transition between Acheulean, Lower and Middle Paleolithic, this is so widespread, and the environmental changes which must have occurred in place A, that may or may not have occurred in place A, are going to be different from those that occurred in place B, and it's almost certain in such cases that you have to turn and look to something inside the culture, socio-economic system, for an explanation of the change. Since we can't have the same environmental change in Western Europe, the Levant, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, yet there is a broadly comparable shift in the form of stone tools.
One interjection, though, and the Cormuzan obviously isn't the sum total of the Middle Paleolithic quotes.
Well, that's what we're...
And you've got all these sites out in the desert that have tools that are already incorporated in, although possibly not too far distant in time, in the bottom of the Korosko Formation. In other words, there was Middle Paleolithic prior to the Korosko Formation, at a time when still the climate was quite moist. In other words, when we're talking about the Cormuzan, we're talking about a very late thing by comparison with
Yes, well, there are cross currents. Desmond
Paleolithic,
actually
whatever
phrased
you
his
wanna call it
question in
stuff.
terms of Mousterian, not in terms of
Well,
Cormuzan.
in terms of,
Well, you can-
there's another problem, I think, talking about Acheulean to Mousterian. Mousterian, at least that I worked with, in terms of the percentage of retouched tools, suggested these were habitation sites. I don't believe we can say the same to any of the Acheulean sites. We may not be able to compare this. I don't doubt that there were many flake tools in the Acheulean, but we don't have the habitation sites.
Well, how does the Mousterian then compare, that of the Nile, compare with that of the oases? Are there any significant differences that could be
We have,
interpreted?
as far as I know, no Mousterian from the oasis.
I thought there was from
From
Dongo.
What about,
Cargan.
and what about Cargan?
Oh,
Yeah.
the Cargan, the Levalloisian. Well, there are no
Well,
samples.
that's, no.
There are no samples. 6 flakes from here, 10 flakes from there.
Yeah, nothing in seated.
Yeah.
Can't
There's
correlate
no
it with
way
any of the
I think
formations.
there's 43 tools in all the holes back.
No, there are 43 artifacts for the whole of the lower Levalloisian, from 6 sites. Now, you can't make any kind of comparison.
Tony, do you feel happy that the total situation is that out in the desert we had lots of little men making pedunculate points, and in the Nile Valley at the same time, broadly, we had lots of little men making denticulates and burins, and that's your cormusen, and they share a basic technology between them. And there must be some environmental reason for this?
No, I don't think so. I wouldn't be an environmental determinist in this sense at all. If the Aterian in fact develops out of a Maghrebian Mousterian, there is no reason to assume that long-term cultural adaptation and traditions didn't play a part in making both the Cormusen and the Aterian unique in relationship to each other, while they still share the same very generalized technological tradition. I mean, that technological tradition is widely spread.
Tony, do you find pedunculates in your Mousterian at all?
No,
Okay.
none at all.
But there are pedunculates in the Mousterian in the Maghreb
That's
also.
right.
Yeah.
One swallow
Very, very
just
few.
doesn't make
Yeah.
some.
Yeah, there's some French who
badly
love pointing out
expensive.
there's a pedunculate somewhere in Acheulean Stade 3 or something in
That's right.
Sidi Abdurrahman as well, which
Yeah.
I've heard held up.
But perhaps Fred, in his concluding section of the Nubia volume, raises the culture area concept in connection with Nubia. And I think this may be one of the most useful ways of discussing the thing, whether we can recognize culture areas in North Africa in particular, involving the Nile, whether they have ecological correlates, whether some of the features of the record are to be attributed to environmental changes and some to fluctuating boundaries of culture areas, all of which are possible. And presumably we're discussing this morning primarily the environmental component in explanation, but obviously you can't discuss it in isolation, since you have to decide which of the features are culture historic and which are environmental economic. Certainly, the Aterian seems to be a good example of this, because the Aterian, as we now know, is quite diverse, but it does have, in a sense, the properties of a culture area. And there do seem to be ecological correlates to this culture area, that it is confined substantially to arid North Africa.
Yeah,
and
but
it
the
fades.
North Africa then was not the North Africa now.
But it was still almost certainly more arid than the Sudan.
It wasn't as arid as the Nile. Or was it more arid than
Well,
the Nile? There's
is
a
the
good
Nile
question.
arid in the
All
sense
right,
that
this
if you
is a good
have a
question.
major river which floods once a year,
That's right.
are you talking, I don't think
That's
you're
right.
talking about an arid situation even if the rainfall is zero,
Yeah, you
in a
have
meaningful
permanent
sense.
Permanent surface water is what counts in human terms.
Yeah, but
No,
in terms of
vegetation
ecology,
and so on.
it's a distinctive situation. You've got a pattern of restricted settlement down the lifeline of the valley,
Yeah.
and there's just nothing possible on the outside except just going out there for a Sunday afternoon stroll.
So we're agreed that the environment is quite different
For the
inside.
Cormusen. But this is very important to make that restriction. In other words, if we're talking about Middle Paleolithic, or we're talking about Aterian or Cormusen, we're talking about different time ranges, we're talking about different ecological situations. This is why I think Tony's point of not wanting to lump the Cormusen just offhand is important, because it
I
is
don't wanna lump
stratigraphically in the wrong
Cormusen.
place, and it is ecologically distinctive.
All right, well, to tack onto it, the question of the Halfa. This same kind of,
Before we take that, can I just
Right,
make
sure.
a point? That very often in prehistory, people seem to equate rainfall and environment. Now, it seems to me the Nile has a very distinctive environment, even if it has the same rainfall as the Sahara. And, just by the fact that there's blooming great river flowing there. And so that it surely is beyond dispute that we're dealing in the Nile River strip with a different environment from the Sahara at any time.
Yeah, but there's
Simply because the river is.
Yeah,
is
but
the
there's
difference.
a distinction to be made. If you have a megafauna adapted to a sort of semi-desert shrub in adjacent parts of the desert, and depending on the edaphic conditions, having a whole range of ecological areas that can be exploited in various ways, and if you have a situation where the desert is absolutely barren, and your entire megafauna is that is restricted to the riverine forest. These are two ecologically completely different situations. In other
I'm
words-
not talking about uniformity through time.
No, I mean, you know, to say that the Sahara is dry anyway isn't the same thing as saying that Sahara does offer the opportunity for a new set of ecological opportunities.
Sure. But this is the point I'm making, that dryness is probably a bad word. What I was saying is that the Nile is different, not that it's not trying to define the difference for the moment, but that it is different from the Sahara. And any discussion of the ecological relationships of things in and outside the Nile Valley, which ignores the fact that it's different, is likely to get bogged down. Now, part of the difference is that you have a choice. You can operate from the Nile Valley and do things that the chaps who live right outside it do also. You can go out and you can go in. And so you're dealing with something which is A, different, and B, is more complex by involving the junction of ecological zones. And the contrast and the degree of contrast and so on may well have fluctuated through time, and this may be a factor in explaining the record that we have. But it seems to me that throughout time, the Nile Valley has been different from the thing on either side.
The main difference is surely between the Cormusan and a Tyrian are in the end products, surely. You have minor differences in the cores, flakes, and so on, but basically you have a Lavawa technique and other forms of cores and so on, which you find in both of these. If you remove the end products, there's not all that amount of difference. And the end products, after all, are an expression of what the people were doing with these tools. So therefore, they were doing different things. They were exploiting different natural resources. This surely is the chief difference, I would think, between the two. And as Ben says, the Nile is a very different, I would think, ecological area to the Sahara at this time, where there was a lot of surface water, but not perpetually flowing down a huge great drain.
This would suggest to me, maybe I misunderstand you, but that if a group of Tyrian peoples happen to wander onto the Nile Valley, that in a rather short time they would become Cormusan. And I don't believe that.
Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised.
But now surely we're crossing the wires again. You've got an environmental and a culture historic component, and we don't have the opportunity to make the experiment. So you're posing a false question. All we can say is that out of the record it definitely emerges that however they got there and wherever they came from and so on, the chaps who did live in the Nile Valley made very different artifact sets. Now this almost certainly has one part of its explanation has to do with the culture history, the sequence through time through which they went, and the reason that they are confined to a particular narrow zone almost certainly has environmental correlates. That is, it's not just a coincidence that the stuff along the Nile is different. So that both factors are involved. I would like to say one thing in relation to what Desmond said about the finished products being related directly to what people were doing. I think what slender ethnographic evidence that we have relating to stone tools shows that you can do most of the basic operations with a wide range of very different looking toolkits, and that a major component in any toolkit is this history of design traditions. And well, obviously there are active features in stone toolkits. Most of the things that we analyze and study are probably much more in the realm of fashion and design history.
I'd like to interject something. It's something that kind of bothers me. I think before we talk about any of this stuff, and if we're going to talk about the Nile Valley, the Nile River Valley, and the Nilotic microenvironment, we should first of all define that here at this table. First, to show what was available to any group of people at a given time, such as the kinds of stuff that Michael Coe and Ken Flannery did at La Victoria and Ocos stuff in Guatemala, where they showed there were 6 or 7 different microenvironments available. These people at a given time only exploited 2 or 3 of these microenvironments. In other words, are there limits of the microenvironments in the Nile Valley itself? You know, I mean, how many are there? I mean, are there ponds? Are there dunes? Are they on cutoffs, et cetera, et cetera? I think we should define that first before we even talk about the Godin and the Cormuz and all these other things.
That kind of analysis has not been done. What's the problem?
Well, some have been done at a point. Let me ask the question in this way. how many places up and down the Nile now are there where Cormusan or Cormusan-like things, no matter what they've been called in the past, exist? Okay? From lowermost Egypt all the way as far up as you can go. How many are there? You have Cormusan, for example, where Smith lived.
No.
No.
Nothing at all. And what about farther downstream?
Its distribution seems to run from Ictiaria, that's
Near the Sudan.
near the Sudan-Egyptian border, to Murshid, which is just south of the Second Cataract. That would be, what, 40 kilometers, maybe more.
Actually,
50 kilometers on the distribution map.
50 kilometers.
Yes, but
Then-
remember that map doesn't reflect everything that all other groups have done in the Nile.
Yeah, but
Isn't that so?
in the case of
Because that's the question I'm
Komombo,
asking.
the
Yeah.
case of Komombo, in
Right.
those formations
All right.
that are part of the Mas and presumably the Deber Ajer, we have good sections going through sediments that should have riverside occupation, and there's nothing in them. They are absolutely sterile.
All right, this is part of Jim's
In other words, it
question.
isn't just, out in the floodplain mucks that
Right.
there's nothing, but in fact, on levee bankments and
Right.
so on, where in the late Paleolithic time range you've got stuff, we haven't got anything.
Right.
We just don't have it. It's bare.
Deba.
I think there's one way
Deba,
to,
there's something vaguely similar.
Yeah, but no Lavalva in it.
Oh, yes. A lot of it.
Not of the same thing.
N2 and N6. I mean, there are no burins, which is a major kind of difference. There are very few. But the range of raw materials is wide, the Levallois technique is wide, again, denticulus, which aren't terribly significant, but converging type of denticulus, this sort of thing that goes a little beyond the just messy edge, is present. But it does have bifacial elements which are missing in the Cormuz.
So what you really get, essentially, are in very restricted areas, right? Different kinds of things happening. And then later on in time, you get Halfin kinds of things in central Egypt, and you get them all the way down into Nubia. It reminds me, especially the Cormusan, of the typical capsule, which is very, very restricted. I'm not talking about artifacts at all. No, nothing to do with
About
it.
distribution in this
Exactly,
case.
exactly.
well, the pattern, I mean, I think this comes out quite clearly. The pattern in the Nile Valley is one of a series of areas which are heavily occupied at given times, and the time range is rather restrictive to these different areas. I think in the past, what's happened is the ecological aspects have tended to be viewed as there being, at the most, three major variables: the cataracts, the Nile Valley itself, and the encroaching savanna. I would suspect there are a minimum of 10 different microenvironments within that, and that what we don't have is a reflection of the specific utilization, the resource exploitation of these environments. I know at the sites in Egypt that I talked about yesterday, there are at least 2 zones being exploited. There's the river itself, and then there are the savanna-like margins to the side. There are other sites in the area which technologically and typologically are quite distinct, which seem to be exploiting the same resources, but in different proportions. And then there's the problem of poor formal preservation. But what we don't have is the ecological correlate of the techno-typological material that comes out of these. But it's quite specific. I mean, there is nothing to the north, as far as I'm aware, with the possibility of one site that in any way resembles the 5 assemblages that I've gone through. There's nothing that
Anyway?
Huh?
Anyway?
No, I don't mean that. I'm sorry. There is nothing which specifically
Yeah,
resembles them
okay.
in terms of the type, in terms of the parameters that I have dealt with.
Mhm.
Nor is there anything, with the exception of the Sabekian, I believe, which specifically resembles in the parameters the material that Jim has analyzed. And this is a pattern that builds up. The complexity of the thing is vast.
That's right.
And I'm strongly of the opinion that there are ecological parameters to this complexity.
Well, there may also be that it's just that in a narrow strip that it's segmenting longitudinally. And this may
Well,
also
well,
be related to
but-
a somewhat competitive situation. And this is a possibility.
Well, that, of course,
communities are partially interned. And one of the things that societies prepare to do when they are in turn is to distinguish themselves from their
Well,
neighbors.
I mean-
They generate rule systems
Yes, of
and
course,
so on,
and you
which
get a very
partially
similar,
isolate
you get a
themselves.
very similar sort of pattern, for instance, on the Peruvian coast. Each
Mhm.
river valley had a very distinct
right.
cultural manifestation. But at the same time, there is a generalized technology to all this, at least the late
Mhm.
Paleolithic material, which I think is quite distinct, with the exception of the Sibelian and the Halfdan.
Mhm.
These all form rather an interesting unit. There is considerable variation among them on many aspects, but I think the problem here is to look at this as somehow a complex which is exploiting different resources within the area. Now, I don't know how we get at that, but I think it's one of the major things that we should be discussing.
wonder
Yeah,
if
well,
that-
this of course is the question, whether these things are related to exploiting different resources or whether they're related to differentiating mechanisms in the cultural system, not so much in the economic system. And I don't think you can assume that because they're differentiated, it's because they have major economic differences. And almost certain that economy, just as the tools are being differentiated, there will be differentials in the economy as well, that perhaps the whole of culture is mildly differentiated into these segments.
Well, this is something we would get into this afternoon more, but I'd just say here that I think one of the problems is deciding which is the most significant variable, either the technological parameter or the typological parameter. I tend to agree with you that the forms we see of retouch tools are basically stylistic in many cases, that they are not functionally defined because you can use a single tool for a multiplicity of purposes. I think what we have to look at is the technology of these industries.
And I think using that as a criteria, we have shown, looking at the stuff yesterday, so we have shown that there really are, in a given area, no direct relationships between various sites. I mean, they were done.
No direct
I know, I disagree, Jim.
I disagree. I mean to say that in a general milieu, yes.
That is that they're
Yes.
linked to a sort of industrial complex.
Probably, right.
And
But
then distinct
on
in
a
another way.
distinct
No.
site level, they're not the same group of people.
And it's a
coming
fascinating
back.
package.
No, I'm sorry.
that's
They're
a
not
nice
the
site
same
that's
group of
third
stone
order
tools.
abstraction.
You know, we've been sort of implicitly, I think,
Sloppy semantics.
discussing the Nile as if it is capable of being exploited continuously along its whole stretch, and that there are no clusters or areas that are more favorable than others. And I think of the Kamambo Plain, for example, which is decidedly different from good stretches of the Nile, and it would support a large population, presumably, where other places may not. And I'm wondering now about whether or not we might consider areas along the Nile that are less favorable, perhaps, in some ways or other, as being, in a sense, barriers. Now, if we're talking about culture groups, we have to have a certain number of people, perhaps, to maintain a viable breeding population. Some people suggested 500 may be suitable for this purpose. That doesn't take up a whole lot of space, even under hunting-gathering conditions. I'm wondering whether you might conceive of clusters of groups of people of that order of magnitude, perhaps, spaced along the Nile and maintaining themselves more or less in isolation. The isolation being perpetuated by perhaps difficulties in transportation. I don't know how difficult it was to walk along the Nile, but my impression was that there was, you know, it could have been swampy, mucky, overgrown, and whatnot. And we think of the Nile as being a nice river to transport yourself around, but
Only with a boat.
with a boat, okay.
Well, Frank, there's very good evidence for intergroup conflict.
That's a
mean,
good- well,
Fred has that cemetery
Yeah.
at Jebel Sahaba.
I think we have one very clear barrier along the Nile, just south of the Second Cataract, the Bab el-Hajar, which is about 200 kilometers of Precambrian badlands, where the cliffs go right down to the Nile. And we just have very small silt embayments, and often
even
you
above
can't
the
get at
cliffs,
them.
the rocks are all sticking
Yeah,
up like.
I mean, it's an unbelievable area. I spent 6 months in it, and I think all told I found 3 prehistoric sites. And mean, there's just nothing in there, and that's a real barrier south of the Second Cataract.
Yeah, you can think of barriers and you can think of opportunities. The Kamambo is an opportunity, and some of the wadis that Carl's been talking about.
And the
I mean,
second
Why wasn't
very
the
favorable
Cormousin
times.
there if the civilian is there later in such
Yeah.
a quantity? This is the way to ask the question, perhaps.
One of the most interesting things I think about this Nubian Nile study is the fact that in a sense, you almost get an exaggeration of features which are very widespread at this stage, and the tendency after your long periods of poor regional chronological differentiation in the lower and a little richer in the middle, quotes, middle Paleolithic. But during this late Pleistocene period, the world over, culture does start to fragment on a regional basis, and through time you get much more rapid change. And at least the data as it's now presented for the Nile looks as if it documents a rather special case where in a sense almost it's speeded up and fragmented to an even greater extent than maybe usual. Maybe also that the resolution here, your resolution at the moment is better for open sites anywhere than almost anywhere in the world
Again,
at this time.
looking at the view from the way we presented it, and not necessarily from the way you might view it, but except for the civilian and possibly the Halfman, which there may be some question about that, but certainly for the civilian, there is very little similarity in the industries and the assemblages we have between Kamambo and Nubia, up beyond the now, part of this may be the fact that we have a large gap there which we could not examine because the reservoir already existed. And so that if we had been able to see this entire thing, it may not have been an actual sharp break that it appears now.
How big is the gap?
It's nearly 100 miles, isn't it?
I mean, that's nothing.
One of the things that I've always found very puzzling is that from about 15,000 BC until about 10, we have about at least half a dozen fairly well-defined units north of Aswan and south. But there are only two of these units which are found both north and south, the Sibyllian and the Halfan. The others, which are based largely on blades and bladelets, are never found, as far as I know, south of Aswan, which suggests that there was some kind of barrier there. And it's probably productive to think in terms of the industries with Levallois techniques as being perhaps more closely indigenous to the region, and being able to permeate north and south of Aswan, if you want to think of it in metaphorical terms. But I don't think that it's a complete coincidence that you do have this break at about the first cataract.
But Phil, wouldn't you agree that also at perhaps the most general level that it's useful to think about, that the blade and bladelet, the little bladelet industries of the Nile, and these people are in fact looking across to the Maghreb and comparing them, that in a sense the Nile is also involved in a sort of very large scale culture area, and if you come from other parts of Africa, then it's quite definite that for all that you can distinguish quite distinct and interesting groups within these little blade things on style, they also have a strong family resemblance which extends all along the North African coast,
Yes.
and in fact into other parts of the Mediterranean basin.
Very much so.
But
So
I think it's significant that at about 10,000, 12,000 BC, something in that range, and somewhat later in time thereafter, the most numerous sites in all of Nubia, and the largest sites, the heaviest population, are the Gaden sites. And these, I asked Phil, I said, do you see anything like that in Kamambo? Never saw anything like it. We have seen nothing like it as we go northward into beyond that into Egypt. This, we cannot see anything like over elsewhere in North Africa. So this break that we're just discussing is, if we look somewhere to find some vague resemblance, I assume we're going to have to look south for that. Is this, no one here seems to have said, well, Gaden looks very much like something that I had. Is there any resemblance in the Gaden stuff from material to the south?
But I think the question should be, even if there was a relationship, say what does it mean?
Well, that's,
if you're talking about 3,000
first I'd like to find
miles.
out if there is a
Yeah,
relationship.
I mean, just because like with my sites, I say it's related to Lala in some way, it doesn't mean anything that it's related to 2,500 kilometers away. It doesn't mean a thing in cultural terms.
And how far south do you have to go before it starts picking up anything you can look at?
Very
Well, the garden is not that unlike some later Stone Age industries, but this is maybe the similarity of generalisation, and there it is with lunates, which got all over Africa south of Sahara. Probably many of them somewhat less old than the garden, but some of them probably do go back towards that period of time.
The thing, is this barrier then that we see at the first cataracts, is this an environmental thing? Or is this a cultural phenomenon, or both?
Why can't it be both? Why shouldn't it be both? They're long established. If you postulate two long established communities on either side of this boundary, this could be a bit of both. Initially, the boundary was established through environmental factors and then got translated into a cultural factor. It was then established within the two communities. The other guys lived over there. They didn't.
Well, it still exists today.
Fine.
Oh,
Great.
Maybe it begins at the
Great.
first cataract,
Yeah.
ends at the third,
Yes.
and we only know part of that area.
Mm.
That
There are
area seems
linguistic
quite,
differences today.
quite
Or where probably people
homogeneous. Our work at Deva was south of the third cataract, and we're in something entirely different prehistorically, and today it's still different.
Well, surely one can think in terms of frequency of interaction, and if you stick 200 kilometers of quite different and rather severe terrain in, then you can predict without being a genius that the frequency of interaction across that will be less than the frequency of interaction on the strips on either side. And it shouldn't perhaps be too
But
surprising
at the
that this
first
will be
cataract, we
reflected
don't have
in
that.
partial isolation of
Yeah, but the
tradition.
river north of Alagi, all the way to the first cataract, is very narrow.
You know,
It's certainly nothing like the Battle of Majar, but it might have been enough. I mean, it was a border march right through recorded history, even though they were, for example, people of the same type living right up to Aswan. The political no man's land was really in that stretch of very narrow country that the Kanusi and so on have sort of been forced to evacuate from, because that was the first thing that just didn't leave them anything by way of a margin of moving out when the dam started going up the first time.
Is the first cataract the beginning of Nubia? Yeah. So the
Today,
barrier,
yes.
barrier exists
It
there.
used to be at the northern end of the Kamumbo Plain. In the Old Kingdom, the border was Jebel Sosala, and the border of the Nubian language in the 19th century was still at Tirau. So it's a fluctuating zone between, in fact,
Yeah.
Aswan and the top of the Kamumbo Plain.
How far does the Nubian sandstone go north of Aswan?
It terminates just about around the city itself. And there's a break then,
City of,
well, Aswan itself.
yeah.
It's roughly in the middle of town that you make we go out in the cemetery to see the transition.
And
on
yet the
rocks, yeah.
civilian populations were not using the Nubian sandstone, they were using the Pharaoh sandstone, they were using chert.
Kamombo, there isn't any.
At Kamombo.
At Kamumbo, they were using,
I see.
they're using, well, north of Kamumbo, at least they're using Flint. Why do you,
Yeah, but I thought Carl said that you did get the sandstones north of, Aswan is, yeah, sorry.
Aswan is sorry. I think something else that might be interesting to pursue is the width of the floodplain and where sites are located. Like at Isna, the floodplain is it's a very wide floodplain. It's on the west bank at least. I don't know how wide it is.
I think our general experience is that's where they find the sites, but
Mhm.
part of that's because that's where the silts are preserved. And this is one of the things that bothers me, and one of the cautions that I put in about the stretch between the Aswan and those silts that were covered by the first reservoir. Because there are some clues from earlier writers that they did find small flint implements in these silts. And I think that if we had some idea of what these look like, we might be able to
Well, there is a description in Vandier, Manuel d'Archaeologie Egypte, of some sites south of Aswan on silts, which, judging from the very limited description, appear to have been backplated sites.
That the one Beauvais-Lapierre collected?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's in Aswan itself.
And then there's another one further south that I can't remember the name of the area now, but it's now within the reservoir region.
One of the things we haven't mentioned at all is the effect of seasonality on the distribution of sites. Of course, you have that here in North America. Stuart Streever has been investigating that in the Lower Illinois Valley, where he finds quite a marked distribution between the groups exploiting fish and clams and so on in the river bottom and the sites up against the cliff a few miles away, the cliffs. This has intrigued me a bit at Kamombo. Can you see any way of interpreting some of the site distributions on the Kamombo Plain in terms of seasonality?
The late Paleolithic stuff, I would think yes. Both Jebel Silsila 2B Area 1 and Area 2, quote, show evidence that you're dealing with a seasonal flood channel. The Area 1 was occupied immediately as the water was going down, but still presumably there was considerable water there, on the edge of the levee embankment. And Area 2, the people were in fact sitting right on the floor of the channel when the floor was still mucky, and were stomping the tools down into the mud, which you could in fact find sticking in all kinds of vertical positions inside the mud. So it must have been still quite wet and gooey at the time they were in there.
Where was this going?
This is at Jebel Silsa, north end of the Kamombo Plain. So in both cases, you're dealing with a situation that is sort of late flood season or just post-flood season.
This is something that had occurred to me at the isthmus sites, the Ariel Fakuri sites. This intensive exploitation of the fish could conceivably be a seasonal factor. I couldn't quite figure out which season it would be.
Post-flood.
Post-flood, I would suspect, when the river was beginning to drop, which might explain that reworking of the material.
There's only one problem about this seasonality, and where did they go? Because we've looked outside the Nile Valley quite a bit, and there are no sites out there. So if we're going to talk about seasonality, they moved up and down along the Nile.
Rather than sideways.
Well, they could have, there's at least one case of civilian 40 kilometers from the Nile.
One
Okay,
site,
yeah,
but we've made a tremendous survey out there, in some instances more intensively than we did along the Nile, and there are no sites. You know,
Because
we
you
walked
could
up
move
these wadis from
between the
miles.
inner and the outer edge of the floodplain. That is, if you were going to primarily operate in the dry savanna outside the valley, you might put your base camp close to that margin of the floodplain, provided you could find surface water there.
But I don't really think you had much of a savanna to operate in outside of the valley during this late Paleolithic period.
Well, somewhere.
But the valley is very
Okay, well,
broad
this brings us to another question.
Some of
Which
them
I
are
don't
lucky
know.
lower down.
Can somebody reconstruct the zonation of vegetation? Because the Nile Valley, as you see it in photographs now, has nothing whatever to do with what we're talking about. It's all agricultural and chopped out. But we are told that they were hunting savanna animals, so if it isn't that they lived in the desert, they lived somewhere else. And I'd be interested to know if we know anything about where they did.
And the nature of these animals, I mean, it's hartebeest and bus and gazelle.
Well, there's something that might be, the sites, Borgo Moccasin, that Vignard described, might be something along those lines. If we assume the ecology we had in pre-dynastic times, you have the actual levee and channel situations, and then you have the alluvial flats that are seasonally inundated and dry out, but support a seasonal vegetation with grasses and presumably sort of open thorn bush and parkland or whatever it may have been. In the case of the Kamombo Plain, this particular seasonally inundated environment, or one where, as today, the seepage water, in fact, is noticeable miles inland still through those silts, might have been important, and this may in fact explain how it was possible for some of the sites that are, what are they now, 15 kilometers or more on the edges of the desert, way inside in the embayment, may have been
Yes.
of this kind. This is worth thinking about. I never thought of it like this.
This is what I was thinking about when I asked that question about seasonality. I was delighted when you brought up that matter of interaction, because in a rather sloppy way I've suggested several times in the past that the Nile Valley of Upper Egypt, at least, was a kind of interaction zone. And I find it very intriguing, for example, that the civilian is the only case, as far as I know, anywhere in the world where you have the Levallois technique and the microburin technique combined. And is it just more than a coincidence that this seems to appear in the civilian at about the time that you get a microburin technique appearing also in what I call the Sicilian?
Can I just
No.
throw out a useful ethnographic parallel which has just come to my ears? I gather it's not published yet. Carl Hyder has been watching New Guinea Highlanders murdering each other in ritualized warfare, where you have adjacent communities coming together and very carefully organized and fighting and occasionally killing each other in the process. Now, this has nothing to do, as far as he knows anyway, so far with economic competition. This is a very, very complex sociological phenomenon. That doesn't matter. The fact is we've got two adjacent antagonistic communities living right next to each other, and apparently what happens is that they fire off arrows at each other, and these get returned back and forth, and there's no sense of arrow ownership at all. And at the end of the day's fighting, you take home a bundle of arrows which you've picked up in the field, and no one recognizes any particular style, and there are a great range of different arrowhead styles. So even in when you do have two adjacent and very antagonistic communities, there is the opportunity for interchange of weaponry. It does actually happen.
Dorothy, you mean like students and faculty?
Yeah, arrows.
I think what we're trying to get at here is why there seems to be such a great diversity in the final Paleolithic of the Nile Valley. But first I'd like to go back a bit and ask the people south of the Sahara, does this strike you as being a great diversity in terms of what you know there in the later Paleolithic?
Yeah, I think so. We don't have anything like the same resolution. Garth, I think, has a slightly different view, but we don't have anything like the same resolution that you've got along the Nile. So that it could be an entirely false impression, but I don't think that you can find changes, to be sure, and regional differences in your later Stone Age, but they don't involve the scales of typological, technological difference that is apparent along the Nile.
And I get the impression that this is true. This is true also in the Maghreb, from what little I've seen of it, that there isn't the enormous diversity which the Nile seems to provide, at least north of the Second Cataract. And I think there are four things that we might think about.
There isn't in the Levant.
Yeah, but I beg to differ with you about the Maghreb, by the way, because in a general milieu, in the industrial complex, yeah, they're bladelet industry, they're bladelet assemblies, etc. But the differences are so vast.
But per square kilometer.
There aren't that many sites per square kilometer.
That's
Remember, the
the
Inland
problem.
is a literal industry. There's a literal kind of thing, and inland near those shows.
But we're talking about a very narrow tube now in the Nile Valley, whereas you're speaking in Maghreb of a huge area.
And the other thing is
from,
that we're also
Tunisia to the Atlantic.
Could we hear what he's got a final point, then?
No, I've been, there are at least four parameters, if you like, which might explain some of this diversity. One, of course, is the possible richness and diversity of the habitat itself, especially in favored areas such as the Kamambo Plain, and I suspect the Korosko Plain in Nubia before it was demolished, which may have required very sensitive technological adaptations to different activities, if you want to think of it that way. Another, of course, is that the area may have been so attractive that it did act as a magnet to other groups, and I suspect this is what really explains the Sicilian, which I believe firmly has a Mediterranean basin origin. A third one is that there were rapid local changes, perhaps environmental, perhaps others, which induced very rapid technological transformations. And a fourth one, which has been mentioned very briefly here occasionally, is the matter of population density. I've been working on this in connection with the Near Eastern, the Mesopotamian final Paleolithic and early Neolithic in the last few years. I think it's something which has been grossly underplayed in terms of cultural change, not only increasing population density, but decreasing density, particularly as it refers to land use in agricultural times. But I believe it's also a very important phenomenon in hunting-gathering groups. And I was very pleased at a meeting in Pennsylvania a month or so ago to hear Don Dumond justify that on the basis of his Alaskan Eskimo Indian data.
Do you include population density competition as part of that factor?
Yes, very much so.
It occurs to me, I'm thinking here in terms of, I think you are too, in terms of Binford's model of population equilibrium in the Near East, late Paleolithic, that it's quite possible that you, though the Nile system is undoubtedly a very rich environmental resource, that we don't really know. I think, Fred, you feel that there was a stable population for much of this period in terms of its numbers.
I don't know that I'd want to make that.
Well, you
statement.
did in the original, but perhaps shouldn't now. Certainly the density of sites indicates that there may potentially have been a very dense population of different peoples in the area. The problem here is, of course, were all sites occupied simultaneously. If so, I think it's quite possible that the Nile Valley and the Sahara area being what it is, it's potentially feasible that the carrying capacity of the biomass could have been exhausted quite quickly in the area in any one given time, which could lead to the kind of fragmentation that you see. I don't know of any way to bring data to bear to prove this at the moment, but I think it's something that hypothetically can be looked at as a potential causal factor. It's very much sort of combining your 4 points, Phil. Bringing them together.
How much evidence is there for any quantities of hippo in, let's say, 5 or 10,000 year range of time in some of these sites, or in sediments, site or no site? Is there, are they common things?
Bit in every site, isn't there?
There's usually one.
I mean, they're very big animals, their bones are readily preserved, tailless especially, so on, femurs. Because nothing will destroy any habitat any faster than hippos. They're the most destructive animal there is, in a very tight environmental setting adjacent to, and especially seasonality playing a role here with the annual flooding and so on. And one wonders if this kind of thing also can't play a very deterministic role, especially where there's different widths of the valley and so on. So these kinds of factors would also tie in.
Do you mean that the human population could have affected
Human,
the
animal,
quantity?
animal-human interrelationships and so on.
Because the hippo population itself would surely find an equilibrium, wouldn't it? It's,
Well,
I mean,
sometimes
you
they
didn't-
don't.
you
In
wouldn't
Queen
get-
Elizabeth Park, they didn't find an equilibrium until you went and shot about 20,000 of them.
But isn't that a special circumstance?
Yes, but
in
it's
that
also a
they couldn't
special
migrate?
circumstance to be able to kill hippos.
Yeah.
It's not, they are not necessarily a real easy animal to kill in certain levels, certain technological, well, you could argue that.
Yeah.
The other
Some
thing that
certain
does
cultural
arise in
adjustment.
connection with the point that David made about population pressure is that we can talk about population pressure without talking about populations which have got to the point where they're really degrading the environment, because there's good evidence that there are strong social responses long before you reach the carrying capacity that you mentioned, that societies take steps, in effect, to see that they don't live anywhere near the
The
carrying
budding in New
capacity.
Guinea is a prime example.
Yeah.
Communities.
There is some other biological type data that relates to the Carl's point on the aridity of the Nile Valley at this time. Between the area on both east and west banks, from Kena to almost to Isna, and tracing along the remnants of the Sahaba silt, we found a trace of burn, a burn horizon that was everywhere continuous. And we traced this out to the valley margins. This appears to have been one hell of a brush fire which swept down the valley and engulfed the entire valley during, this would be over 100 kilometers. And from both banks. The brush fire stopped at approximately the same area today where the vegetation stops. That is, it was, the vegetation limits were at the floodplain limits that time as well as now. This presumably would have been a fire that could have occurred a period of maximum dry season before the flood. I think then we must assume that there was a very limited savanna
It suggests a fairly dense stand of dry grass, though, doesn't it?
Yes, well, you get
carry
this
it.
today in the floodplain, you see.
Could I just answer an earlier question of Phil Smith's thrown out at the people in the South, and also phrase it in a rather sort of nigger in the woodpile fashion? The problem was about diversity, and he asked, did we find in the South anywhere such a parallel diversity? I'd like to point out that this very diversity is the product of a new kind of research, a new style of research. It's for the first time ever in Africa that we've had people looking intensively in very limited areas. Now, I'm sorry to keep harping on this, but I want to quote the Orange River scheme. 200 square miles. We walked over it and found just under 1,000 separate localities, artifact localities, and dating from about 40,000 up until the 18th century, we found 11 discrete typological entities. We were very fortunate in having these in a stratigraphic sequence as well, but there are 11 different entities within that time span. So this is really a product of looking harder in a limited area, and maybe thinking of special environments and so on in these terms is a little premature. Perhaps we should look harder in a lot of other places and see.
Well, this
the
is,
same
of course,
pattern
partly
will
this
emerge.
afternoon's topic, but the other question is,
Everyone
how do you
keeps
measure
telling me that.
diversity? We're talking about greater and lesser diversity, and these are subjective impressions. And for instance, we had a difference in opinion whether the Maghreb is as diverse as the Nile or not. And we have no satisfactory measures of this. I mean, to be sure, as soon as you look at culture today, and paleoculture in the archaeological record, very hard, you discover that it is diverse, and that in fact each community has its own version, and that it splits up in a very complex fashion. The question is the degree of commonality, and how far the divergent goes in any case, and how many markedly divergent things there are. And we don't have any way of measuring this. So some people look at the same material and say, well, the Maghreb stuff is just as diverse as the Nile stuff. Others would say, no, well, this is clearly, they all have a family resemblance, whereas in the Nile stuff you have several families of things.
Well, I prepared for another occasion a comparison of indices from about 15 or 20 different sites in the Maghreb, which I think I'll have Xerox later on this afternoon and pass out to everyone, and we'll discuss it. See what it is.
Can I say make a brief comment on another subject here? I was rather taken aback when in the space of about 2 minutes, several rather dubious statements concerning population ecology cropped up here. Exhausting the biomass, for example, which I think starting way back with birds, only coming right up to this man and the hunter symposium, we've had a fairly strong consensus that these hunting-gathering kind of populations seem to operate at what, 0.2 to 0.3% of any instantaneous kind of possible support that an area can afford. And you get these temporary fluctuations. I was bothered by something Clark said about the Kaizo hippopotami. They exploded into an environment that had been provided for them and very quickly would have stabilized themselves. If man hadn't shot them off then, they would have been dying off very quickly anyway. They were destroying their own environment in that case. And
well, they would have dispersed, probably.
Yeah, something would have happened so that that particular plot of land would have been supporting a reasonable hippopotamus population. And I would be very skeptical of the kind of suggestion you made here that people were in fact overexploiting a local biomass and leading to the...
Well, I perhaps misphrased that, but I think there's one of the things that's dangerous in this kind of comparison of modern hunting and gathering groups to the Paleolithic situation is a comment that Board made in, I believe, the Manhunter volume. You are dealing in any Paleolithic situation with a very limited human population in relationship to the animal population, and it's the distinct reverse today. The same constraints do not apply in the present hunting and gathering populations to the Paleolithic ones.
I don't follow that.
Yeah, you destroyed your argument, didn't you?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well, one of the first things one would say is that
What
this
I'm-
is something that man in the Pleistocene was a hunter, that he has only a relation to the animal environment.
Yeah.
And there's very good evidence to suggest that hunting is only In many cases, it's a
Only a very
subsidiary
small
thing.
part of the-
And
of the
so,
system.
so there can well be, and the Nile may have been an example where there were more men than ungulates.
Yeah, no, but I think the point that I'm trying to make, and perhaps haven't made it well, is that there is no, as far as I can tell, there is no exploitation of a specific resource per se, a food resource in the Nile Valley. It's a very broad-based
What about
system.
catfish?
Huh? A lot of catfish, but you see, it's not only catfish. There are very few sites in
Could have been
Egypt.
for a certain period of the year, though, a tremendous